Welcome back. This week we're going to talk about Southwest Asia and North Africa, also or probably better known as the Middle East. Okay, so here's your learning objectives. Again, you can review these on your own later. They're just in there again, kind of more for notes review for you guys. So this region, again, as with every region, it can be argued as to which countries belong to a region. But generally, I agree with how the book has organized these regions based on this particular criteria. So last time we talked about sub-Sahara Africa, which technically doesn't include very much of the Sahara Desert. This does include Northern Africa or the Sahara Desert. And again, part of these countries are included in this region because they don't fit in with sub-Sahara Africa. We've also got the Arabian Peninsula, which is down here with Saudi Arabia, Yemen, a couple other countries. We've got the Anatolian Plateau up here in Turkey. Technically, you have a little bit here, which belongs. It's part of Turkey, but kind of geographically speaking, like physically speaking, it's a part of Asia or Europe. And then we also have the Persian Gulf, which is down here. Probably most of you have heard of the Persian Gulf Wars. So this refers to over here as the Persian Gulf. So this region is really important. And one of the things that I think historically, as well as even contemporarily, makes it important is its location as a crossroads for Europe to the west and north, if you're in Northern Africa, obviously, Asia to the east, and Africa to the south. And we'll talk about this. You'll see when we get to some of these different sectors we're going to talk about. It's home to approximately, more than 506 million people. This was about a few years ago, so it's a little bit out of date, but it hasn't grown substantially since then. Some of the unifying features that we see across this region are climate. While there is some variability in climate, there is a lot of similarities. Culture. Generally speaking, across the region, there's a lot of similarity in the culture. A lot of similarity in the history, as again we see with a lot of what regions share. And an interesting political situation that doesn't really unify a lot of other regions is the fact natural resource, and in this case, it is oil. This region is also characterized by very diverse languages. A lot of times we think Muslim countries must speak Arabic, and therefore it's all the same. Actually, a lot of the dialects are not necessarily mutually intelligible as well, but there's also diverse languages across this region, diverse religions, and also ethnic identities, which can be a very important aspect of this region. Another thing that we're going to talk about is Arab Spring, which happened a little bit more than a few years ago now, and it was a series of protests started in one country and just kind of created this domino effect of protests across the region. A lot of discontent with governments in general. Some other factors that influenced this series of protests were you have a larger young population in the region, and due to political and economic and social factors, these young people, I would say in many ways what we could compare with the millennial generation, our own country, is that they're finding they don't have the same opportunities that previous generations have had, or there's not enough opportunities for their entire generations, this huge group of people wanting to go into the workforce. So a lot of people, young people, disgruntled with the government and started protesting. Some countries, the protests led to overthrowing the government eventually, and other countries like Syria, which is kind of the other opposite extreme, we've seen what has resulted in a civil war within the country. This region is also characterized often by sectarian violence. And we'll talk about this when we get to geopolitics. And then this region has also seen the emergence of ISIL or ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The current status, the most up-to-date, it's kind of one of the things that almost ran out of fashion or ran out of popularity, and the news largely seems to have stopped talking about it because somewhat recently they've declared that ISIS has been defeated. I don't know what that means. There has been a lot of talk about what to do. We're talking about thousands of people who have been detained, who were even foreigners who have been detained, and who are part of ISIS, depending on which country they happen to be in. And a lot of their strongholds have been lost. So there has been some talk about, certain governments, what do we do with these people who are from a foreign country but have been here fighting in our own country against our own people, which is creating an interesting geopolitical situation for a lot of countries. Another very interesting thing about this region is that it's a cultural hearth. So hearth is kind of like the birthplace of something. We could have language hearths, like the birthplace of languages, a specific language or language families. We could see the birthplace of agriculture. This region, the birthplace of agriculture actually is from here, like domesticated agriculture. A lot of early civilizations are also from this place, and major world religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, 3 huge religions, and those are all primarily here. Their birthplaces are from this region. And being agricultural hearth, so this is where we saw the first, historically speaking, agricultural revolution in human history. So I have down here this map, you'll say, of where food is from. So a lot of times we don't realize, and I actually might argue a couple of these based on other maps I've seen now that I'm, bananas, for example. But anyways, you can see that a lot of the food, so people often think potatoes. Where do you think potatoes come from? Most people associate potatoes with Ireland, so they think that potatoes must come from Europe. Potatoes are actually native to South America, to the Andes mountain range. So this is an interesting map. You can see this is where plants are actually from, where they were domesticated and then taken to other places. Wheat, which does quite well here, is actually from Southwest Asia. Or sorry, not here as in Hawaii, but here as in the United States. I just find this really interesting. You can see Southern and Southeastern Asia, so which would have then led to Oceania, and then to Hawaii, to the Polynesian Islands. So coconuts, breadfruit. What else do we got that is pig, sugarcane, taro. Tea, a lot of these things have been introduced. So I just find these maps very interesting to see. Horse is another interesting one. Most people aren't aware that horses actually, where do they have horses? They should have it in Asia. Yeah, horse they have for Southwest Asia. So horses actually originally were from North America, and they crossed the land bridge to get into Asia. Once that land bridge was cut off, horses actually became extinct in North America, and then thousands of years later, they were reintroduced by Europeans to the Americas. So while we do have what we call native populations or wild populations, such as the American Mustang, they're actually introduced animals, introduced species. And then another major political factor, more contemporarily one, we've got on the right, we have OPEC. So these are, if I'm not mistaken, there's 13 countries. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I believe there's actually another one. So we have, actually it's not on the map. There is a 13th one. So anyways, OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC holds a lot of control. You'll notice that the United States is not included in OPEC. These countries own, and we do have a substantial part, or a substantial amount of oil, but not quote unquote enough, or not. It's partially, again, to exclude the United States. But these countries have worked together to try and control the price of oil, and they have primarily done this through controlling how much is being produced and sold and being extracted. We'll talk a little bit about OPEC as well. So physical geography, I'm not going to go into this too much, but a lot of times I wanted to show you some different images. A lot of times we think this is just dry and desert and sand, and as you can see from these pictures, that's actually not the case. So the Atlas Mountains, which have snow, some of the huge landforms, the Maghreb, the Levant, Yemen highlands, very lush green areas, the Jordan Valley, again, quite lush and green. This region, for a lot of its agricultural success, they've used irrigation, which has led to a lot of problems. We'll see. So again, what we see the picture here on the left, you can see the Nile River flowing north, and alluvial fan we'll talk about. You can see that fan up there at the top of the Nile. Well, I think we talk about the alluvial fan in the next unit. So this is kind of what we tend to think, very arid, dry regions. The majority of people that live in Egypt live along the delta, live along the green areas, but it's a very lush and it's a very natural thing. It's not, yeah, obviously you can see, some we have controlled and man has influenced a lot through damming, and we'll talk about this a little bit here in this part. But this is what we tend to think of this region. So again, aridity does dominate the region. It is quite dry. If you look down, we've got dry climates are the salmon color and yellow. But we do have wet climates. I was asked students to try and find it. The wet climate is actually this little tiny point down here. There's no other wet climates, but we do have Mediterranean summer dry climates, which does have some rainfall. Not a lot, but it does have more rainfall. So you can see the rainfall is down here at the bottom. So there's a little bit of rainfall. Not a lot, but there is some. And then the temperatures are also going to be different. And the temperatures for this region have a lot to do with latitude, but it also has a lot to do, you'll see. So climate is a huge, altitude is also another factor as well. So again, we also see a lot of Mediterranean climates, which is very good for agriculture, specific kinds of agriculture. One of the things that this, as we tend to talk about environmental problems in the regions when we get into this section, one of the things that is a large factor here is lengthy human settlement. So this is this is a land that is quite dry. Doesn't necessarily hold enough water to support populations and support the populations, the levels of resources that we use. But it's a really long, again, this was the birthplace of human civilizations. And you can see that this long history has ultimately what has led to this build-up today of a lot of the problems that we see. So some of the examples that they talk about, some of the environmental problems. We've got climate change in the Atlas Mountains. So those are the big mountain ranges that we saw there in the beginning. Largely climate change is influencing. You saw there was snow, so there's glaciers, which then provide water. There's a lack of snow and has obviously led to more arid conditions, lack of water for people. We've got over here the Jordan River. We'll talk about when we get to geopolitics, hydropolitics, which is basically the mix of politics and a lack of water resources, which has led to a lot of conflict for a lot of countries, especially for Egypt, for example, as countries down river want to start damming. This is then removing water that's coming into their country that they also need. Desalination plants, a lot of areas, a lot of these countries get water, especially in the Persian Gulf area, by desalinating the water. So they process the water, remove the salt from it. It's a solution for a lot of countries, but it does produce a lot of, what do you do with the salt, this brine salt that's produced from it? It does, it's not without its problems. Also the energy that is required to process the water. Socotra is an interesting situation. It's usually called the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, a very isolated, unique, much like what we'd see with a lot of islands, but a lack of human population for a long time allowed it to continue developing without a lot of ecological impacts. And then finally, we'll talk about as well Saudi Arabia. They give you the example of like fossil waters, so really old aquifers that, much as what we'd think with fossil fuels, fossil water, these are very old resources of water that have been filling up over thousands and thousands, if not more. years, and we remove the water at much faster rates than it can be replenished. So these underwater ground sources are being depleted. So some of the things we're seeing are, this is an example of Socotra's. They've actually got this dragon blood. We also have dragon blood trees. They're different than this. They're very different, but we have dragon blood trees in other areas of the world as well. It produces a red sap that a lot of people use, depending on the tree. I don't know particularly about this one. We have it in the Amazon. Then they can use the red sap, actually use it for like medical treatment. You put it on wounds and stuff. A lot of other issues that we're seeing across this region are deforestation, overgrazing, regarding livestock, and salinization. Salinization, I think that's the next slide. Salinization is when, not with a watering can, but when you are irrigating land. So there's minerals and salt in the water that, I'm not talking about salt water, but there naturally is salt in the water. And it's the amount that transpires here, and it's the long amount of time that they have been irrigating and providing irrigated water. Basically, it evaporates and the salt stays behind, the minerals stay behind. And so this here is an example of salinization, where the soil has virtually turned white. Here's a closer picture of that. And this is the problem that has largely impacted across the region. So dams is some of the things we've talked about regarding like hydropolitics. I mentioned where countries downstream or downriver want to build dams, and a lot of these are doing it as well for energy, to produce electricity, which then also creates the situation, as we're seeing with climate change. We're going to see reduced water flows. Temperature changes will ultimately create more droughts. So again, as the dams will eventually become obsolete because there's not enough water, that's going to then lead to other issues, such as how to provide enough electricity for people. Choke points is also another water-related issue that is affected in this region. So waterways are, water not only being a part of life is very important here, but waterways for transportation is also really important here. So in this region, so a choke point is basically where, like this, for example, where there is a very narrow passage in a waterway, and basically countries can control quite easily who goes through, who's allowed to go through. So this is a huge strait. This isn't just like a little creek or a little river. It kind of appears that way, but it's a satellite image. So this is what we refer to as choke point, which can cause a lot of political tensions as well. So climate change, I've talked about a couple of the issues. What we predict to see in this region and what we have been seeing is temperature changes. This is already a very hot region. Having an even more exacerbated higher temperatures will obviously cause environmental issues. It's also predicted to see higher rates. You think about hearing hot summers in the United States, and a lot of people die in New York City, for example, elderly or people with weak immune systems dying. This place is no different. Also seeing sea level rises, much as with everywhere else. And climate change is also, because of the exacerbated environmental consequences, especially related to water issues, we'll continue to see political and economic costs as well. Okay, I'll stop here and we will continue with part 2.